Okay, let's get back to the fishing, shall we? Get some bait on. And because I didn't know when I started where I was going to catch, I'd had the 2 swims going, but this seems to be going pretty well just as it is on the 8 metre swim. So I'm more than happy to stay with this and keep building it with a bit of feed each time and see if we can keep it going. As I say, sometimes you can keep that going for a long time, other times you might only get 3 or 4 fish, and at that point it's worth alternating between the 2. But if things are a bit slow, the plan is to make sure you keep feeding that outer 11 metre swim so you can go out to it and start to catch fish when this inner swim dies. And off we go. There's no rush at this. If you rush it, you'll make mistakes. So just keep a rhythm going and you'll find you can catch a hell of a lot more than you can if you try and rush it. Hey hi. As I said before, it's getting a little bit more windy today, and so the idea is to make sure that you keep your pole tip pretty close to the water, or indeed sometimes even under the water, just a small amount, and that stops you from getting drag and making the float act unnaturally. And of course, if you haven't had a bite for a while, another tip you can use is to just lift gently and let it drop down again. That makes the bait rise in the water, of course, and drop down. And of course, if you've seen any of my underwater footage, you'll notice that the carp with their fins throw the bait up in the air as they're feeding, and so therefore you're just recreating what's happening there. The idea being that if they see it and it's right in their eye line, they're liable to make a beeline for it, and Bob's your uncle, you've got a bite. Try and steer them out of the way. As I said, you don't want to be spooking the rest of the fish in your swim. I do seem to be getting smaller fish today. Give it another lift. Just gently allow it to go back in. Okay, well, I've been on the 8 metre line for a short while now, and as expected things are slowing down a little bit. So what I'm going to do, because I've been neglecting the 11 metre swim because it's very difficult to feed 2 swims at once when you're catching plenty of fish off one of them, so I'm going to put some bait into the pole cup this time, and I'm going to feed that swim whilst still fishing the 8 metre swim for the next few minutes. We'll give this a bit of time to settle, and then maybe feed once more before we start to fish it. Still catching fish on the 8 metre line, but it's slower than it was, and they're relatively small compared to usual. So let's see how we go. Okay, well, as expected then, the inside swim's died a little bit. So I've gone out at the 11 metre line. I've fed it a couple of times and I've given it sort of 10 minutes or so to percolate, shall we say, and I've just literally shipped out over there now. Let's see if we get a bite. Okay, well, that's 2 minutes before I got the first bite on the 11 metre line. Again, a fairly small fish, but all good fun. So it just goes to show that alternating helps, because what happens is the inside swim, the 8 metre swim, you create such a commotion sometimes that it spooks the fish and they back off. So in this case it does appear they've backed off and we've got them out at the 11 metre line. Now we may be able to get them back on the 8 metre line at some point, we'll see. Be careful, you see I've just got that twisted around there. If that was to be round there when it was shipped out, you wouldn't have any elastic, it would have got caught up and you'd have been smashed off. Now this, as I say, because this is 11 metres, as you can see I can draw this along on the pole roller, just allow it to come along, and obviously at some point it'll tip forward. Then you just have to be gentle with what you do, nice and slow, and when you get there just drop them in, put your rig in, and away you go. Smaller and smaller today. So for the purposes, whoops, for the purposes of the video, oops. So there we go. Smaller and smaller today. But for the purposes of the video, it shows you how it works and it makes it easy for me to get them in. Now if I'd known I was catching or going to catch fish of this size today, I probably would have gone for a lighter elastic setup, because as you see on those very small fish it isn't pulling out very much. So because I'm using a barbless hook, the idea is to make sure that you keep the pressure on them all the time, as in no slack line. If you give them slack line, you're just as easy going to drop them off and lose the fish. Okay, so what I'm going to do now, I've got a bit of bait out at the 11 metre line, but I still want to use the 8 metre line. So what I'm going to do is, as I'm shipping this one out, there, I'm going to just feed the 8 metre line again, just to keep it ticking over, see how we go, and then ship out onto the 11 metre line. It's always a bit more tricky when you have to feed 2 swims like this, but that's a good way of doing it. Obviously if things get really hectic on this line, we'll have to be using the pole pot to feed probably most casts anyway. But you don't necessarily want to be feeding 2 lines heavily at the same time, because you want to be catching well off one, and if it slows down, rotate back to the other. That's a better fish. See the elastic pulling out like it should, and this is why I use the number 18 elastic. There we go. The trouble is, if you fish places with rather large fish in, like I do, sometimes you'll be catching small fish and all of a sudden you'll catch a really big one, something in the region of 15 to 20 pounds. And the problem of course with that is that if you've got a really light elastic in, you're likely to get bottomed out and broken off. Here we go. And they often fight more just as they get to the edge, of course, as you probably already know. So just take your time. Now, if I tried to pull that in now to get to the landing net, it wouldn't work, of course. And that's where you use the puller bung. Pull it out, grab some, out again, and now you're shortening the amount of elastic that can stretch. And so in a second, once we've got this one ready, oops, so in a second, once we've got this one ready, you'll see how by taking the elastic to that length, we've shortened it down and been able to net the fish. This one's fighting rather well. Again, not a huge fish, but best of the day probably. And here we go. Yeah, good fish. Okay, so what I did that time, I actually fished about 2 feet to the right of where I put the bait in. If you think about it, the bait went in a big pile, and so my bait was going to be just in amongst that pile. And of course, whoops, there we go. And so what that means is, of course, that there's less possibilities sometimes for the fish to be picking up my bait before it's hit all the other ones. So by taking it 2 feet to the right, fish like this one, which are picking up stray bits of bait or just approaching the area, see my bait on its own and pick that up quickly, and you get a bite very quickly. Okay, so it's gone a bit quiet out in both swims, and I've got a pot full of ants at the moment. But what I'm going to do is, because it's getting towards the end of the day, I'm going to try something different. If it doesn't work, there's nothing lost, because I'll be packing up soon anyway. But if it does work, it just goes to show that next time I come, I can try something like this. I put a hell of a lot more pellets in, I put a hell of a lot more corn in than I have been doing, and I'm going to ship it out to the 11 metre line and just see if that induces more bites. So here we go. Exactly as before, just put them in. I'll just put this off to one side, just get rid of all the ants. There we go. That way you're not disturbing the swim. Leave that for a few minutes and then go in over the top of it and see. And while I'm waiting, we'll go back in and we'll try the 8 metre line just in case. Now, because this is only a short tutorial, what I'm going to do is I'm going to stop fishing those 2 lines now and just explain to you about what we call the inside or margin line. Now, just down here it's about 2–2.5 feet deep, and I've just been throwing just a few bits of bait in by hand down there over the past hour or two, and now I'm going to use the shorter rig, which is set up for that depth down there. Same float, but 0.3 of a gram this time. Put some bait on, and very often what you do with a margin swim is you leave that till a bit later on. If you're in a match, there's a whole way of doing things, but for pleasure fishing, fish out the swims out there and then come down in here and try it. Now, it doesn't always work on the inside line, but it's a good option to have once the other 2 lines have died on you. Well, that looks like it for another one then, folks. Looks like there's a storm coming in. Getting some rumblings of thunder in the background, and they are forecasting some fairly heavy rain today in showers, but nevertheless I'm going to get soaked. So I think we'll call it quits at that. hopefully I've shown you, as I said at the start, some basic techniques to show you how to catch fish on the pole in the summer. Obviously in the winter we'd go lighter, but that's something I'll do another video on when the winter comes along. Anyway, you know the drill. If you liked it, click the button. If you want to subscribe, you can. Until the next time, bye for now.